Hello and welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. I'm Richard Hill in conversation with, and today I'm in conversation with Chris Aiken, Dr. Chris Aiken, who has co-authored a fantastic book with the very wonderful Dr. James Phelps on bipolar, not so much, an understanding of your mood swings and depression. And Chris is such a fascinating person. Compared to me, he's a young fella, and Dr. James Phelps is older, more in my frame. But Chris is director of the Mood Treatment Center in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He's an instructor at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine, an adjunct assistant professor, Department of Psychiatry at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He's editor-in-chief of the Dahlitz Psychiatric Report and the Mood Disorders section, editor for Psychiatric Times. He's active in medical research and has published on the treatment and diagnosis of mood disorders. So lots and lots of background in this fabulous area, looking at bipolar. What is it? Where does it go? How do we utilize it? What can we do? And this is what we'll be asking Chris, and I'm sure he's going to give us some fabulous insights. And don't forget, we're on all your podcast channels as well as on YouTube. Go in and check out the Science of Psychotherapy channel on YouTube, and you will find all of us there. And of course, this podcast will eventually be on the scienceofpsychotherapy.net, which is the academy, where you can actually get a little certificate for some time spent in watching it that hopefully you can use with your associations for ongoing education. But short of all that, it's just fascinating to talk to someone like Dr. Chris Aiken. Chris Aiken, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy in conversation with podcasts. And so I got a hold of your book. I've had a little chat about it for a couple of minutes before we started, talking about bipolar. So important. Bipolar, I love the title. Bipolar, not so much understanding your mood swings and depression. So I can see it's directed at people who have the difficulties, but there's no one like therapists who need to understand what the experience is for people who are in these difficulties. But you've written a few more books. There's a lot of stuff we could go through, but perhaps rather than me prattling on, can you just give us a bit of a build-up which brought you up to this book, and also your association with James Phelps and how that came into being?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here, Richard. And I started out before medical school. I was in the arts, literary magazines and music and poetry. And when you're in the arts, a lot of people in that crowd have mood disorders. I just thought of them as creative and eccentric, but now and then they'd go to the hospital to get some rest. And I just thought they needed some rest. So I never really thought much of it, but I really had a deep heart for these people. And I went through my training, got really interested in borderline personality disorder, and that's how I started out. I set out to be a therapist doing DBT therapy for borderline personality. I didn't have any knowledge or interest in bipolar per se, but it happened that they did these studies showing that in an average psychiatric practice, about 40% of the patients with depression have some form of bipolar. And I thought naturally, well, mine's like 1%, so one of us must be wrong. And so I downloaded all the instruments they were using, the rating scales and the questionnaires, and I started giving them to all my patients just to figure out what was going on here. And lo and behold, the patients started answering a lot of yeses, to which I thought, well, the patients must be answering the questions wrong. They can't all have bipolar. So I kind of came into it reluctantly. I viewed the world more in terms of personality, and I still do in many ways. But I've come to understand through this other body of research how mood disorder intersects with personality, overlaps with it, how the genetics commingled together, and found a lot more avenues to help the patients that I was treating.
Yes, I think it's something we've certainly been talking about it a lot, and it's one of my sort of principal elements in both of my books. Is first of all, we got to understand we're a complex system of integrating and disintegrating elements, and so isolating them is fabulous for researching to some degree, but you always got to bring it back in to the complex, which you've done so excellently. And I'm just thinking, I mean, I was actually an actor for 25 years. Uh, Excellent training for psychotherapy, I've often said, but yeah, a bunch of weirdos there, including me at some stage. But
It is great training for it.
Stephen Fry is a great example of someone who's come
Oh,
out very publicly talking about bipolar. Richard Dreyfuss is another one, you know.
oh yeah. Many in the arts community. And I would say to that we all meet people who are eccentric and creative and talkative and full of ideas and hyperactive and always doing new projects. That doesn't mean that they have bipolar. That's just a unique individual. But when you see those kinds of traits and they also cycle in and out of depression quite frequently, then you ought to think about bipolar.
Yeah, and it was interesting. Stephen Fry, when he talked about it, he would go on manic episodes, but he was a very successful, wealthy actor, and so he would not be. It would be strange for him to go down and spend several $1,000s on this, that, and the other thing, and ten speakers and 10 things, and but what about and this aspect of we're talking in the book, looking at those people who are just in the workplace or in places where it's not so, I guess, looked after. A lot of actors tend to get looked after, as you say. Oh, it's okay that you're a bit odd as long as you give good performance. But a lot of people who have these difficulties are just in the workplace. They're at schools. What are the sort of thoughts and ideas and understandings that you've come to with that general experience?
Yes, the majority of them are in the workplace. And one thing I'll point out about bipolar that you touched on there is the nature of hypomania or mania, which is really a state of heightened excitement and energy and impulsivity, is that you're going to go over the line, whatever the line is in your culture. So when they studied mania in the Amish, which is in America a very old religion where they try to live like it's 1820 and keep everything horse and carriage. So in the Amish, the signs of mania were trying to vacation at the wrong seasons because it's a farming community. You can't do that. Urges to use a public telephone because you can't use electricity, and racing your horse and buggy too fast. So very different. And on the other side of that, I've treated say punk rock musicians who live a very wild lifestyle by the nature of their business. And that's all normal to jump off the stage and smash amplifiers. So I treated a fellow with bipolar and I said, now, I don't really know that you have bipolar. I mean, all this stuff you're talking about seems like it might be normal in your profession. And he looked at me deadpan and said, oh no, my band wanted to have me fired. So and yeah, that's true for the lead singer of Guns N' Roses, who has bipolar and was almost fired before their album came out. So in every culture, there are norms. They're just different norms. And people with mania or hypomania will push those boundaries. For myself, I work in a hospital town where a lot of people are hospital employees. And you can imagine you don't have to push too far to break the hospital rules there.
That's an incredibly valuable point and brought out so beautifully. That a lot of what we call a disorder, OCD and BPD and various things, a disorder is when it counteracts or interferes with your capacity to manage in the culture, in the society you're in. So I love the fact
That's how our brain expresses itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the idea of the punk rocker who's not manic enough, but a lot of it is depression. And of course, there are quite a lot of people who may not experience a manic experience at all, yet still have this bipolar. So we have this sort of unipolar, bipolar discussion. How do you help people get an understanding of that distinction, or what distinctions do you give it?
Yeah, if I can do a little history for those of us in the field, I think it'll be helpful, and we'll seize what you just brought upon. Bipolar disorder, or what was then called manic depression, was discovered by Emil Kraepelin in Germany. And Dr. Kraepelin was a very keen observer. He lived on the hospital, watched his patients and their families. After 30 years of observation and charting, he tried his whole life to pull apart unipolar from bipolar, and he couldn't find a clean line to separate them. He said, Such a separation inevitably encounters innumerable difficulties, such as you think they have unipolar, and then they end up having a few manic features during their depression, like agitation and racing thoughts. So, fast forward from 1930 to 1980, and the DSM, for the first time, thought they had found that line that people with mania and depression were different from those who just had depression. And they were right. There's different genetics and treatment responses. So that's when the word bipolar really came about. Before that, it was all manic depression. And if you said you had manic depression, like I know Frank Sinatra in his interviews would say, I'm a classic manic depressive. Well, we don't know in the 1950s if he meant he just had depression or mania. So back then it meant depression or mania. And we just recognized, lumped it all together. So 1980, we split it apart into unipolar and bipolar. And as soon as that DSM-3 was written, there were letters in the journals protesting by doctors saying, well, wait, there's this whole group in the middle, some 40% of people with mood problems who have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. They respond to lithium. Some of their biology looks like bipolar, but they don't have mania. And that's what this book is really about. Bipolar, not so much. It's about that 40%. And a remarkable story there is that the doctor who split them apart, Dr. Jules Angst, he's still alive, he's 94 years old. He became one of the leading advocates to put them back together. And he spent the next 40 years of his life studying those 40% in the middle who have, like you said, recurrent depressions, lots of depressions, a little bit of manic features here and there, but not quite full mania. And his research got absorbed into the new DSM, DSM-5, which really does lay out a spectrum. That's how we view the disorder in our book, as a spectrum. They have conditions in there like you can have major depression with mixed features, a few manic features. You can have major depression with brief hypomanias that last less than 4 days. We know that's quite common. One of your Australian psychiatrists, Gordon Parker, studies that a lot. So there's a full spectrum. To summarize it up, the way I view it is that mania, hypomania, and depression are just two sides of the same coin. The illness is one coin. And these things are so biologically intertwined that they're present in the same person throughout their life to different degrees, varying degrees. And if you see such a patient, the way they're going to look is just chronic recurrent depression, because we know that they spend only about, your person, even with full bipolar 2, the real DSM bipolar 2, with depression and hypomania, they're only going to spend about 5% of their life in hypomanic states. And a lot of them are going to be anxious, uncomfortable states, not the kind of pleasurable hypomania that we have so much stereotypes about.
It was interesting, Dr. Phelps, this wonderful collaboration you've got, because he's been around a lot longer. As you say, he's in retirement now, and you're lovely and beautiful and young, and I'm in the middle. What was it, 2006, his book, where he described it was a spectrum approach to the bipolar. So he was a bit of a forward thinker in that.
He's just a person who's open to new ideas and open to doing anything to help his patients. So he came upon this stuff some 25 years ago. I came a little bit after him and was clearly inspired by his ideas. And then he put forth in the journals that there was this rating scale. We have so many self-rated scales that are highly criticized, like people reporting their own symptoms. And this was a new rating scale that blended both the clinician's observations of real hard facts with the patient's report. It was a unique way of diagnosing it. And he said somebody ought to validate this. So I took it upon myself to validate that scale. It taught me a lot about bipolar. And I ran it through with all of my patients, about 2,000 people. And when I published it, I sent it to Dr. Phelps and thanked him for putting the word out that this ought to be done. And of course, that's how we got connected. And then we started working on the book together.
Oh, wonderful story. I love that. My mentor, Ernest Rossi, I just latched onto him and kept bothering him for years until he gave up and decided to mentor me. Now, when you go through it, you talk, so this spectrum idea, so it's not even so much a Venn diagram type of thing, but this spectrum. And we're talking about that with autism. We talk about spectrums. We talk about that to some degree broadly. I'm very comfortable with it myself in my studies. I think spectrum is a much more way again that complexity framework. And but in that, so you've got that sort of 40% in the middle. Um, is it a distinct, are there distinct elements, or is it really just a fairly fluid thing where you can move around on the spectrum? You can sort of be in this phrase, but under certain stresses or certain difficulties, your condition shifts into a different frame, or are you more or less in a particular frame and then you experience that aspect of the spectrum?
I think your second point, more or less in that frame, is more to the point because these things are highly genetic and they set in usually around age 15 to 20. And once you're in the bipolar side of the spectrum, you're likely to experience those symptoms. Although one difference is we tend to see more of the hypomanic features in the younger years, like the teens and the 20s. After
Mm.
about age 35, people kind of fade to black and it's more just depression until maybe, another thing in the life is they might get an injury to their frontal lobes, whether from not enough oxygen, sleep apnea, or head injury or dementia. And once the frontal lobes start to go down in older age, that's going to unleash a lot of mania, just like having too much alcohol shuts off your frontal lobes and you start to act a bit manic.
Yes, the frontal lobes in that regulation, that inhibitory sort of activity that goes on. Uh, So I think now I'm just because I'm champing at the bit to get to this part, but I don't want to rush it. But so you've got these elements. You tend to find yourself in a framework, a frame of responsiveness, but it varies and alters, and it must vary and alter because otherwise it wouldn't be treatable. I guess. So treatment. So there's treatment. So one of the things you really latch onto and give a lot of focus to is the way we live. So, I mean, we call it lifestyle, we call it various things, but this balance of if you could talk a bit about that. There's medications that we use, as I say, lithium responsive and so on and so forth. Can you give us a bit of a frame? Well, that's a spectrum too. Well,
Yes,
I,
exactly. Yeah.
I'll stop talking and
So
just
the
leave you
lifestyle
with the
is a
question.
is a wonderful thing to touch into because this shows us that we're all more or less have mood problems because we all respond to this kind of lifestyle. The stuff I'm going to talk about, I do myself. I started doing it really to write the book. And I'll tell you, Richard, I can't stop doing it because if I stop, I feel really off. I feel jet lagged. I feel wrong. So, what the lifestyle involves is first off, we call this illness generally bipolar 2. Although I don't think that's a good word for it because when you say the word bipolar, people think of bipolar 1 with the full manias that really can cut them off from society's acceptance. It's a much more ostracized disorder. Bipolar 2 is really a form of chronic depression, or as I'll describe it to patients, what you really have is a fragile circadian rhythm disorder. And that speaks more to what it is. Often we've done an interview where I've picked up on how their mood gets worse around things that alter the circadian clock, the biological clock, things like travel to Australia, like wintertime, like female hormones around the menstrual cycle, around childbirth. So these are classic setups that will worsen mood in someone with bipolar 2. And to the heart of it, there's many causes of this condition, just like any psych condition, but the closest we've come to identifying a cause is the circadian rhythm genes. And lithium, in fact, regulates or normalizes those circadian rhythm genes. So I basically tell them they have a broken biological clock. And I might talk about how the symptoms of jet lag, poor concentration, depression, poor sleep and energy, and changes in appetite are almost identical to the symptoms of mood disorders. So if you have a broken clock, what are you going to do? Well, a lot of my patients say, well, I got to just buy a new one. Well, we can't do that. So we're going to set it every day. And we're going to pay real attention to the things that set that clock, which are light and darkness. So, long story short, the essence of the behavioral therapy for bipolar, which is called social rhythm therapy, developed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania by psychologist Dr. Frank, is all about doing key things at key times of day and exposing yourself to light and darkness at regular times of day so that you get a sense of rhythm, biological rhythm, and you feel more stable in your mood and energy throughout the day.
Yeah, the genetics is quite fascinating. I mean, we actually call them clock genes, which is really really quite specific in their framework. And then we know, just filling you could do well there yourself, I'm sure. But the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which we have up for eyes, just for those that are out there doing their neuroscience, and that dysregulation that occurs because of our lifestyle, because of our modern frameworks. I mean, I often talk about that this unit, this being, evolved in a time when you got up when the sun rose. You were active, hunting, doing various things. Then you stopped when the sun set. But not only did you stop when the sun set, but you also stopped and paused and had a wonderful, mindful experience of grandeur and the turning of night. And then you would socialize and engage. And all these things are natural balances. And obviously became embedded in our genetic structures to enable us to be balanced. And then we go into this world, which tends to leave the lights on a lot, which tends to discourage us from taking pauses, and certainly interferes with regular sleep, and organizers. So, is it very difficult to combat the sort of disquiet that's caused by the modern world? Or once people are made aware, are they then able to get a grip on this difference, this dissonance between the body and the culture?
That's a great question. You know, our culture doesn't give this message. So it is difficult just for patients to accept and believe this message. Once they get started with it, they do feel better. But one problem you'll encounter as a therapist doing this kind of work, what I do is I rate their mood with them as they go through it. And we see that often their mood will get like 30, 50% better after a couple months of this. But that's not all the way. And when your mood is not all the way better, you still have poor judgment, poor self-care. You don't think you're worth it. Stress might slip you up. So a lot of my patients who don't get fully well will keep slipping back into irregular routines. And so it's a kind of a lifelong coaching, this kind of work. And there's a lot of acceptance built into it, and a lot of talking about how it's hard for anyone to keep all of this up. So
Yeah.
patients try it in the real world and see what works for them.
Yeah, I mean, we can't change the world we're in, I'm afraid. So we do have to constantly have a degree of competition between those natural things. I know Stephen Porges, he talks about in relation to trauma, but all these elements he talks about a dysautonomia, that these things disrupt the normal functioning and the smooth functioning of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system as well. And we know that, and I'm imagining this might well, it probably would impact the gut and that gut-brain axis. Is that a direct thing or a subsecondary thing?
It's that's a good question. I don't know if it's direct or secondary, but I know it is integral. And in fact, it's a lot of that's coming out of Australia. Felice Jacka, nutritional science there, is doing work on the gut axis and depression and bipolar. And I would say that in the last 2 years, among the natural therapies, that's where we've seen the most advances, is in probiotics helping not just depression. Now we have major journals publishing those articles showing it's about as effective as an antidepressant, which is pretty impressive. And they help cognition and weight loss, which antidepressants don't help.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just doing a discussion with therapists, a webinar online, talking about the gut brain, and got lots of emails going, "Oh wow, yeah, oh that fits in," but sort of a new realization. They'd heard about it, so these sorts of elements are not strongly. Not yet strongly embedded. And I know when you were looking, I mean, your previous book in 2000 it was the depression, the workbook that you did, and you talked about sleep, sort of very practical aspects of sleep, or what do we in lifestyle we call it sleep hygiene, I suppose, diet. I mean, we know also in the work we do and a lot of others, but sleep and pain resilience are directly related. So there's a lot that happens with sleep and lack of sleep that can disrupt our mood. And if you're inclined, yeah.
So, and I forgot what you're back to your question about primary or secondary. Yes, the 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 gut microbiome has a circadian rhythm, and if your circadian rhythm is off, the gut microbiome gets very off. So there's all that going on as well.
That's interesting.
Inflammation when you don't sleep. So, and these ideas of circadian rhythm, they were really thought central to bipolar because we knew from studies done at Heathrow Airport that when people flew over more than two time zones, they would get manic on the plane, and they observed this. So they knew there was something going on. It all made sense with bipolar. But I would say that people with addictions tend to be night owls and they have very broken circadian rhythms. We know that light in the morning helps people with addictions. You mentioned the autonomic nervous system, and there's a new study, a randomized controlled trial showing that Lightbox treats PTSD, which is amazing. They actually haven't figured out how it works yet, but they know that it works. And we
Yeah.
use that a lot in depression. One message I really want to convey to the listener, and if you can convey this to your patients and your clients, all the better, is that these therapies are remarkably powerful. So we measure the benefit of a therapy by its effect size. And when we talk about dark therapy, which is getting into pitch darkness all night long from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., so in a really dark night where you can't see anything, that treats bipolar mania with an effect size that is about twice as much as a medication. When we talk about regulating your daily rhythms, that's social rhythm therapy, that treats bipolar 2 depression in a head-to-head study. It worked as well as one of our strongest mood stabilizers, quetiapine, also called Seroquel. It didn't have as many side effects as Seroquel, and that's kind of obvious. But one thing interesting about that study, back to what you were saying earlier, Richard, about you're not calling this the neuroscience of therapy anymore, is generally in that study and others like it, what we found is that therapy tends to work biologically for people with mood disorders, yes, but not in the
Mm.
brain. Most of what therapy does is change the body. So the stress hormone system, cortisol, the inflammation in the body, that all goes down. Meds more work in the brain, but they don't help these things in the body as much, like inflammation. We saw that in, for example, that quetiapine study where the people with therapy actually had more positive biological changes from the therapy, but it was all stuff in the body.
I mean, and this increasing amount of work of whole body treatment, whole sense of things. I mean, mind to body is very effective, but actually just impacting and intervening in brain activity doesn't doesn't necessarily do the same process. There's a lot of complexities. We'll have to. That's another discussion, I suppose. I'm just thinking back the study at the airport and looking at that. Is there some information you've got or understanding that you can share about for those people who don't really have that propensity or that dispositions or that genetic state or those various frames we're discussing? And the nature of what can be stimulated through jet lag. Can there be sort of like a temporary disruption which looks or feels like a bipolar or another type of disorder from the jet lag, other than just extraordinary tiredness and but in that 40% mood spectrum, I suppose. What is there something you
Yeah,
could share
so
there?
I think the more likely people are, when you say everyday people who don't have a mood disorder, more likely they're going to exhibit symptoms of depression from jet lag. And we know there's a little rhyme there. If you fly west, you're more likely to get depressed. And if you
West
fly
is
east,
depressed.
yeah, it's more likely to get manic if you do have a mood disorder. But because these are two sides of the same coin, it can really go either way. There's another concept I think we can all relate to. It's actually diagnosed in sleep and neurology clinics called social jet lag. And social jet lag means that you're a natural night owl, as 30% of us are, but you get up really early to go to school or go to work, and then you sleep in on the weekends. So your body, it's kind of similar to if you had flown across two time zones every weekend. You're shifting your schedule that much that you're always a little cranky and can't focus and low motivation. It's a kind of a syndrome of depression almost. And that's one where we can use circadian therapies to fix that, just like we would with bipolar disorder.
Yeah, the body has a way to say, I don't like this. It's what raises these flags. Now, the nature of we've discussed a little bit about that unipolar, bipolar type of aspect. We've done a little bit. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more on this sense of mania and hypermania. You've beautifully just described that it actually, in even those patients just describe with it, it's only a relatively small percentage of their experience. But what's the sort of difference between the two for those people who are looking for some indication to measure their own behaviors by?
Yeah, great question. In the old days, the 1970s, when this was all sketched out, the rule was that if you were hospitalized for it, you had mania. And if it wasn't so bad that your community brought you to the hospital, it was hypomania. But nowadays in America, and I imagine everywhere, it's really hard to get into the psychiatric hospital, so they don't let you in that easily. So we've had to change the definition, and I've had to develop my own rubric for it, which is if you do things that you can't take back, that have irreversible consequences, that's more likely to be mania. So in other words, both of these conditions, they start to go over the line in cultural norms. But you know how it is at work. Sometimes you can say the wrong thing to your boss and you can apologize and get on with it and you're fine. Other times you say the wrong thing to your boss and you're fired and that's the end of it. And we all kind of know where that line is. So the best thing to do is to ask the patient, look for areas of irreversible consequence. Like, did you ever have bankruptcy, lose a job, divorce? Now, 20 years of hypomania could agitate a relationship to where you eventually get divorced. But in mania, you'll get divorced over one weekend of violence and sexual promiscuity and whatever else is going on. But this does vary so much by culture. So here in North Carolina, I work in, it's called the Bible Belt. And I'll treat people from the country who are very deeply evangelical Christian. And I treated someone who threw the Bible across the room. And she was so ashamed and so fearful of what she had done. And I knew that for her, because it says in that book, whoever defaces or changes this book will spend eternity in hell. I knew that in her mind, this was irreversible consequences. That was an action of mania, where for someone else, throwing the Bible may not be mania. So it really kind of depends on the culture there.
Something interesting there is the sexual implications that can occur in the manic stages, particularly. Is this highly problematic, or is this just only in a certain percentage? What's your experience with the sorts of people who get caught up in those sorts of difficulties, particularly, of course, in relationships, and suddenly they find themselves. I mean, there's been a few films about that where people have suddenly found themselves in bordellos and things, and then come home and gone, "Where was I? What did I do?"
So sex, it's interesting because it's one of the more colorful or talked about symptoms of mania, but statistically, it's one of the least likely to happen.
Right.
And the most common symptom of mania is just cleaning the house all night. Why? Because the house is always there. You don't even have to leave it. So to go out and have sex, you have to start relationships. And there's so much inhibition, even in manic people, of doing all this to overcome. What I see more often is people don't start new relationships. They impulsively break relationships. Like I treated a woman with mania who was very committed to her marriage. And then one day she walked in and she said, marriage, it's just a piece of paper. And I'm like, that's not like you to say that. So all of a sudden she was not thinking about the consequences and she was having affairs. So it does happen a lot. The way I put the sexuality of mania, which is quite notable. And even though it's not the most common symptom, it does happen. It's really, there's a broadening of the what Freud would call the object choice in mania. So I've treated homosexual people who become disturbed because they're suddenly going after heterosexual partners, which isn't their way. And I've treated heterosexuals who become disturbed because they're like, can swing both ways all of a sudden. And so people end up with partners that they normally wouldn't have ended up with.
Well, I think that going back to that thing you said earlier, their way or the nature, the way of the culture, the way of the social group, and it is interesting in less populated times. And we had a few films about that over the years, where in the village, those people that behaved or misbehaved, and even those who were actually quite mentally disturbed or deprived and behaviorally deprived, there was a sense of care that occurred and allowance. That's just Barry's having one of his days. Don't worry, he'll be right tomorrow. But we don't have that now. It's much more difficult, I imagine, in this culture. As you're saying, you make too much of a mistake at work, too brazen, and you're fired, and that leads to all kinds of other problems. What happens when someone who has a bipolar issue, they've got bad sleep, they've got stress, they've got these things, and then they're finding themselves sort of going down the hole of disturbance because of the problems they're creating. How do we save those? When do we find them? When do we catch them?
You put it well. It's kind of a vicious cycle. They get agitated and trouble happens in their lives, and then they can't sleep even more, and then they're even more agitated and impulsive. So it's a difficult thing. There's one thing therapists use is the rule of twos, and so the bottom line is this really only works when the person has enough awareness and trust in you as the therapist, and knowledge of what they're going through and dedication to stopping it. Otherwise, it's never going to work. But basically, the rule of twos is, if you get an idea to do something big, start a new business or quit your job, wait 2 days or ask 2 people you trust before doing it. So some people can work this into their life. Another great technique to use with clients in a marriage with bipolar is the scarf. And we use this in regular marriage as well. If things are so heated that it's just going to spiral out of control and you're never going to resolve the argument because it's hypomanic driven, or maybe it's not, like, let's not try to dissect it. That just causes another argument. You just go into a room and put a scarf on the door, and that means I'm better alone right now. And so in marriages, we teach people to kind of wait it out and focus on sleep primarily rather than resolving the arguments. I know today our former president, Jimmy Carter, just turned 100, and he had the longest, most admirable marriage with Rosalind Carter. And they used to ask him, well, Jimmy and Rosalind, what's the secret of your marriage? And they would say, we never go to bed without resolving all our arguments. And that's great, but that's the worst advice for bipolar. Don't do that. Just focus on sleep. Like you said, Richard, just wait a few days and the argument will no longer be important to anyone. And some interpersonal space there.
Yes, you'll possibly like this. I had a couple with these sort of issues, and they would both get a bit that way. They were sports fanatics. And I'm not sure what's done in the football fields over there, but in the round ball, the soccer, and in things, you would have a red card and a yellow card, and so they actually we organised. They had a red card and a yellow card, and if it was going a bit crazy, they would yellow card, and red card mean we have to go to different rooms. And they said it was was very effective. I thought we couldn't necessarily overcome the natural the reactions that their body has to the world, and this I think is one of the issues. It's not a choice. It's not really a cognitive. I know what is better, but I'm doing this anyway. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in society. So I wouldn't have done that. So well, they wouldn't have done it either, but they weren't necessarily themselves, or they weren't necessarily their regulated selves. Is that How's that? Am I capturing
Yeah,
a
that's
good
really
frame?
wise. I like the sports analogy, gives people something concrete to pick up on. And, another thing we see as therapists in working with these couples is when you get hypomanic, you lose the sense of cause and effect. In other words, of I did this, I came in and accused my wife of this, and then she did that, and I kind of had it coming. So normally you can see what you did and what the other person did. Another thing that goes down in hypomania is boundaries. So you often, let me just put it to you this way. I met a woman whose mother had bipolar. I said, "Oh, what's that like?" Because I'm in the field. I really want to know. She said, "Oh, it's like this. Your mother does all these crazy things and then blames you for doing them." So I know that sounds odd, but that was the essence of her experience and is so true to my patients. In other words, what goes on in a marital fight in bipolar a lot of times is the person with bipolar, in their perception, it was the spouse who did it, even though it was them who did it. Or is the spouse who
Mm.
did it first because they lose the sequence of time. It's amazing that my whole day I can somehow remember what came first and how everything happened in order. How is that? But that sequencing goes down during hypomania. So the way
It,
that looks in session is they come in and the normal spouse feels very beaten down and traumatized, and because he or she has been told you did it, you're the cause of it all. And then this charismatic, gregarious person with bipolar is going to convince the therapist that that's how it went, and it's just going to go downhill.
yes, it's sort of almost a sort of a vicarious coercive control, and a non-conscious. And the other thing, it almost feels like a confabulation, where you just take the facts you've got and you create a reality out of
Oh,
those
yes.
facts.
Very true. They're very
Yeah.
good at believing their own reality. Like people with addiction, people with bipolar often are very good at lying or creating fake stories because they got to cover up stuff. So they got to somehow get back into the normal world. Like you were asking about, how do you get back into the world? Well,
Um,
we know that people with bipolar are very good at making new friends and starting over. They can be very resilient, but they often create fake stories to cover up the hypomanic excesses, and they become kind of a false self. Sometimes I'll see them get into middle age and they feel they're very gregarious and social and charismatic, but they'll say, I have no friends because nobody really knows the real me. So I just keep to myself all the time. It becomes a lonely thing.
Yeah, I think one of the sufferings in the increased populations and the division we have, it's just a loss of the ability to have an awareness of kindness. And I find the same thing. I mean, I see people in my area. I mean, I have a sort of a kindness, a professional kindness, but broadly, Richard is sitting there saying, "Oh, who's that idiot? What are they doing?" And there's all kinds of things. There could have been all kinds of interesting things. And then of course, you don't even engage. So you never really know. Community, I imagine that, well, this is what you were saying before, that social engagement and practices of that, of maintaining, of having a community that is reliable, whose mirroring you trust. When they start getting cranky at you because you're saying stuff, you can trust, I suppose, or they're starting to get
Yeah.
uncomfortable with you.
Yeah, you touched on something there, which I want to go into, is like what it's like to be the person who's developing mania. And what I'll say to that is it's not fun. It's not pleasurable. So don't ask these folks as a screening question, do you have moments of intense pleasure? No, they don't enjoy it. Rather, they feel like they're losing their mind. Now,
Mm.
I don't really care if I lose control of my arm and it's flapping around or it's weak, not a big deal. Sometimes it goes to sleep and it does that. If I lost control of my mind, that would be very frightening to me. So it's a lonely, frightening experience, and they feel like they have no anchor. So often you, the therapist, are the one person they can trust. And that's so important because they'll become paranoid about everyone in their family and everyone in their life, but they'll keep that trust with you. And you may be the only one who can talk sense into them, like you and I spoke about earlier. How do you keep people from going over the ledge when they get manic? Well, they're gonna miss appointments with you, and they're gonna ruffle your feathers in some way, but you could still be the only anchor in their life.
And that's so important for both the therapists to understand, and in this message for those who are looking to help themselves, that can trust their therapist. That is an anchor. It's a nice way of putting it. We do have to come to an end, but I know there's so much more. And of course, your book, please, everybody go out and get this book. It's really so good. And also, I really like the workbook as well, which you did in a couple of years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago. But I think that's a fabulous book as well. But is there always the two questions I ask at the end is I'd love you to do just a little summary if there's a final sort of word. But first of all, is there a question I've missed? Is there something that was rattling around? Oh, Richard, you should have asked this, or if we've covered it well, what's just a summary of that you can leave people with?
Yes. So there is a spectrum from mania to depression, heavier on the depressed side for most people. This is driven by circadian rhythms. By the way, that circadian therapy, we've now found that it's effective just in regular depression. And hey, it works for me as well. It works for everyday people. What we didn't get into, though, is a lot of the technicalities of things like how to use a dawn simulator to create a virtual sunrise in your room, how to use these blue light blocking glasses, because most of the products out there don't block enough blue light to really get it pitch dark at night.
Let's spend a moment on the blue light, if you would, because I think that's important.
This was that remarkable therapy I spoke about, dark therapy, which they developed at the National Institutes of Health, just putting people in a pitch dark room. And we were all quite amazed that treated mania. It was very effective, but we never used it because it's so impractical to keep people in a pitch dark room from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. So one thing that my co-author Jim Phelps developed is they discovered in the 90s that there's a third receptor in the eye. So you have rods and cones, and then you have something like melanopsin, it's called, which only responds to the blue wavelength of light. And that receptor is what regulates your circadian rhythm, your melatonin system, your sleep and wakefulness. So Jim discovered this little trick where if you put on 100% blue blocking glasses, they look orange like I just put on, your brain thinks it's in a pitch dark room. So we'll have people wear them all night, and then they don't sleep with them on, but they sleep in a pitch dark room. Anyway, and that treats mania, it treats insomnia, it treats mixed states, agitation. If your listeners are interested in that, I'd guide them to, it's in the book, but for free, they can go to chrisaikenmd.com. And I put the technical aspects of the light therapies in the morning to get virtual sunrises and the dark therapies at night. And that, to your other question, is how you can use artificial technology to live in the artificial world and still keep a regular circadian rhythm.
Yes, I'll have the artificial world. We have an artificial therapy, but it returns you to the natural.
Simulacrum, yep.
I love it. And so, I mean, you were just going through there, so that was really important. That was something I'd missed. And so working through the circadian rhythms, allowing the body to return, your diet, your sleep, all these wonderful things you've said that a lot of people can do right now. They can start that now, these lifestyle practices, and then finding the therapist that provides them the anchoring that they need, provides the stability and trust. And I always recommend that people experiment, find out, look for the person that works for them, because no matter how brilliant you are, that doesn't mean you're entirely suited. So there's lots of great things, and I just have to thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge, which is just beautifully extensive and yet described so elegantly. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. You wrapped it up very well.
Well, bye for now.
All right. Bye-bye.